Right.
what natural science is.
Yes, yeah.
And I think there's a huge problem, and this is another can of worms probably, but there's a huge problem with hermeneutical interpretation in science, like this, the Bible is a textbook. And so
Right, yeah.
I guess, but more than that, it is the warfare that actually turned me off the movement. And I think I would agree with you in that I'd like to see young earth creationism, if it's to continue existing, to get rid of the popular rhetoric and look at the science.
And bring it up to a level where they're at least being honest with your, or maybe not honest, maybe that's too strong of a word, but at least open about the challenges to the model. The presentation you get from a site like Answers in Genesis is that it's all fine, it's all well worked out, and well, how can these godless scientists even believe what they do when there's no evidence to support it whatsoever? And that was actually the line that was being presented at this seminar that I went to. It's like, how can these godless scientists think what they do? Because there's no evidence to support it whatsoever. And I'm kind of going, okay, I promised my wife I would shut up and not say anything. And so, yeah. But yes, I certainly reject the notion that a conflict model is an appropriate model. And as we'll see with old Earth creationism, there's old Earth organizations that are anti-evolution that also reject the conflict model because they actually feel that they have a ministry and a mission to scientists. They want to reach scientists as a people group with the gospel. And I certainly feel that way about my own colleagues. And you would be amazed how many conversations along this line I have with colleagues at other institutions who are biologists. And I have a heart for them to reach them with the gospel. Most of what they deal with in their day-to-day lives in terms of Christianity are students in their classes that are basically highly antagonistic towards them because they're promoting evolution. So it makes for some interesting discussions, and it makes for interesting challenges for me as I'm trying to reach these individuals for Christ. It makes it challenging. Yeah. It's not to say it can't be done, but it puts up barriers for scientists coming to faith. If you've got an outfit that says basically you have to reject everything you know about geology, physics, cosmology, biology, these are what are required. Reject these things and come to Christ. Well, that's hard for somebody who's been trained in that field, right? And I would argue an unnecessary addition to the gospel. I don't think that you should have to reject that knowledge as a current understanding of science in order to come to faith in Christ. I really don't.
Warfare is not really reductive.
No,
I think you could.
No, it's not. It's not, no. But if you want to see true warfare, look at the young earth creationist interaction with other Christian groups who don't agree with their views. Then that's where the real invective will start. Yeah, and we'll look at that more later on. For better or for worse, it's what it is. Yeah.
Why is it more prevalent in the Protestants?
Why is it more prevalent in Protestants? It really wasn't on the radar until about 1960. And why did it not crop up until about 1960? Well, what happened in 1960, well, actually in 59, does anyone know what was a major world event in 1959? The launching of the first satellite, which was launched by the Soviet Union. So the U.S. basically said, we are losing the race in terms of science education in this country. We're falling behind the Soviets. So there was a major reworking of textbooks in the early 1960s. Evolution had been quietly slipped out of the textbooks since about 1925 when the famous sort of Scopes monkey trial took place in Tennessee. So evolution wasn't really in the textbook from about 1925 till the 60s. So in the absence of it being taught in the school system, there wasn't really a popular reaction against it from the evangelical community. But those textbooks in the early 1960s came back with a vigor and put it all back in because they said we need the best science we can to stand up to the Soviets, and it's the height of the Cold War. At the same time, Henry Morris, who was the founder of ICR, published a book called The Genesis Flood, which took some ideas from a Seventh-day Adventist geologist called George McCready Price, who was sort of the lone advocate of a young earth position from sort of the early 1900s to 1960. He was kind of like the one voice in the wilderness that kept this idea alive. Those things all sort of happened at once. So you've got the textbooks which are suddenly chock-a-block full of Darwin again, and you've got this book that's been published from a Christian perspective that basically outlines the young earth paradigm. And I think a lot of evangelicals basically just kind of went with those two things and said, well, here's the response to this godlessness I see in my textbooks, my kids' textbooks. We're going to take this and run with this, not knowing that there had been previous models of interaction that were just not as popularly disseminated. So I think it was sort of those convergence of those two things that kind of went together. Yeah, it was the model at hand that was being popularized at the time where there was a strong sense that there was a need to respond to what was in the textbooks. And from the 1960s on in the U.S., what you see is just sort of court case after court case as the two sides go at it, right? Because the notion was, well, if you're going to put this evolution stuff in the textbook, then we need our creation science in the textbook too. And then the scientists would come back and say, well, there's no evidence to support your model, and then they go back and forth. And, yeah. So the court system in the U.S. has basically been dealing with this issue from the 1960s to the present in one form or another. Yeah, question?
I don't know if you have any statistics, but how would you say like Canada is split up in between like young Earth, old Earth, and evolutionary?
Thinking?
Like thinking, like
It's if you do polls in the U.S., they typically, if you ask the question along the lines of, do you think that humans were created in their present form less than 10,000 years ago, you'll typically get about a 50-50 response in the U.S. So about half of individuals in the U.S. think that's the case. So in that sense, they're advocating a young Earth position in the States. In Canada, we're a little less concerned about this on average, but it depends. If you ask the question in Alberta, you'll get a similar response. If you ask the question in Quebec, you'll get a very different response. But on average, I think it's about 30-35%, which would agree with that statement that humans were created in their present form less than 10,000 years ago. Yeah.
now do old Earth creationists, do they believe in evolution?
No, they don't.
They don't.
Old Earth creationism is sort of a middle ground between young Earth creationism and what we're going to talk about is sort of theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism. It basically says geology, cosmology, and physics, fine, there's good evidence that the Earth is old, but they draw the line and say there's not common descent between organisms. So they're kind of like a middle ground. Yeah, so, and we'll look at that model a little bit more as we go through, yeah. So they attempt to sort of straddle the middle ground.
Like no common descent between anything?
They're not, they would probably, there's variation of course with all these things, but they would probably be similar to a young Earth creationist position on speciation. So limited speciation within a group of organisms, yeah, but certainly no common descent between humans and chimps. That's always sort of the dividing line, right? That's the one that everybody cares about. So discussions of, how related are birds and how related are fruit flies to each other, that kind of gets academic. But the one everybody in the pew wants to know about is, are we related to chimps or not? All right, let's turn to, hopefully,